It was 11 at night on a Tuesday. I was sitting on a taped-up cardboard box in the middle of my empty living room. My back ached from lifting furniture all weekend. I was 34 years old, and I had just accepted a new job as a corporate sales director. The new role came with a salary of $95,000 a year. It was a solid 20% raise from my previous job. I told myself I was winning the game, but as I sat there staring at the blank walls, I opened up my laptop to check my bank balances. I added up the cash I had just spent on the movers. I added the overlapping mortgage payment. I looked at the massive chunk of money that had evaporated in closing costs when I sold my house the week before. I stared at the final number on the screen. My salary had gone up by nearly $20,000, but my actual net worth had just dropped by $30,000. What I did not know at the time was that my strategy for climbing the corporate ladder was secretly destroying my wealth. My name is Mark, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the hidden costs of climbing the corporate ladder. If you are someone who feels like you are making more money but never actually getting ahead, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about how to negotiate your salary or get a better promotion. I want to talk about the invisible tax you pay every time you pack up your life to chase a higher income. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. For years, I believed the standard advice. The advice says the fastest way to grow your income is to change jobs every 2 to 3 years. So that is exactly what I did. I moved from city to city. I bought a new house every time because renting felt like throwing money away. I thought I was building equity. I thought the increased salary would easily cover the hassle of moving. I was completely wrong. I was focused entirely on my gross income. I was blind to the massive wealth extraction happening every time I signed a new housing contract. I thought moving was a minor inconvenience. I did not realize it was an active financial penalty. Every time I boxed up my life, I was hitting a reset button on my financial progress. I was working harder. I was earning more. And I was quietly making myself poorer. The worst part was that the system is designed to make you feel successful while it drains your accounts. You get the congratulations from your peers, you get the new business title, you get the supposedly better house, but the math underneath it all is terrifying once you actually lay it out on a spreadsheet. And that realization on top of that cardboard box was just the beginning. The truth about what those moves were actually costing me was much worse than a few moving truck receipts. I spent weeks after that night trying to figure out where my money went. I had been calling it the relocation penalty in my head. Turns out it already had a name. When I finally went looking, I found out it was called the mobility tax. I did not know it had a name until I started really digging into this. I used to think that changing cities just meant packing a truck and buying some pizza for my friends. Then one night I came across a 2023 report from the National Association of Realtors. The report showed that the average homeowner stays in their house for exactly 10 years before moving, but corporate professionals often relocate every 3 to 4 years. I read that twice. The average person was spacing out the heavy costs of moving over a full decade. I was moving every 36 months like clockwork. I was voluntarily paying a massive wealth tax 3 times more often than a normal homeowner. That meant I was hypercharging the financial system against myself. At first, I only saw this part, and I thought I understood it. Layer 1 of the mobility tax was what I could physically see. The packing tape receipts, the truck rental, the cardboard boxes. When I accepted my new $95,000 a year job, my company gave me a $5,000 relocation bonus. I thought that was incredibly generous. I thought it would cover everything and maybe leave me with a little extra cash. Then I actually sat down and added up the physical costs of moving my life 3 states away. Let me walk you through exactly what my last move cost in physical dollars. I am not talking about the house itself yet, just the physical stuff. The professional moving company quoted me $2,000 over the phone. On moving day, they weighed the truck, and the final bill jumped to $4,100. There was nothing I could do. They literally held all my belongings hostage on the highway. Then came the deposits. I had to put down $1,500 for new utility connections and internet installation fees. I had to buy new window blinds because my old ones did not fit the new windows. That was another $800. I had to replace the large rug that fit my old living room perfectly, but looked completely wrong in the new one. Then came the overlap. I had to pay my new mortgage before my old house finally closed. That was $2,400 just vanishing into thin air. I had to restock my entire pantry with spices, condiments, and cleaning supplies. Another $400 gone. By the time I finished setting up the new house, my $5,000 bonus was entirely gone. I had spent an additional $4,200 out of my own savings just to physically transport my existence from one zip code to another. I used to think a 20% raise was pure profit. Then I calculated that the entire first year of that raise was completely eaten by the logistics of getting to the new desk. But the physical boxes were only layer one. The packing tape and the moving trucks were just the distraction. The real theft was happening quietly in a real estate office downtown. And it was about to cost me tens of thousands of dollars more. I thought the $4,200 deficit I just calculated was the whole picture. I thought that was the worst of the physical costs. But when I dug deeper into my bank statements, I realized I was completely ignoring the invisible physical tax of the real estate shuffle. At first, I only saw the moving truck and the deposits. And I thought I understood it, but I was missing the money I spent just to make the old house acceptable and the new house livable. Let me show you the real numbers of what happens when you decide to pack up your life. Before I even called the moving company, I had to get my old house ready to sell. I had lived there for exactly 36 months. Over those 3 years, I had ignored the scuffed baseboards in the hallway. I had ignored the cracked tile in the guest bathroom. I had let the flower beds overgrow. But my real estate agent told me I had to fix all of it if I wanted to list the house at a competitive price. I spent $1,200 on professional painters to neutralize the walls. I spent $800 fixing the landscaping and putting down fresh mulch. I spent $400 on a handyman to patch drywall and fix a running toilet. $2,400 vanished from my checking account before a single cardboard box was packed. Then came the new house tax. This is the part of layer one that nobody warns you about. Every house demands its own specific things. My old house had a small, flat backyard. My new house sat on a steep half-acre. My old push mower was completely useless. I had to buy a small riding mower for $1,800 just to keep the city off my back. My old living room was a perfect square. My new living room was long and narrow. My expensive sectional couch physically did not fit the space. I sold it for $200 online to get rid of it quickly. Then I had to buy a new couch that fit the room for $2,500. I spent 3 weekends in a row walking the aisles of the local hardware store. Every single trip was another $200. A new water filter for the fridge, different light bulbs for the custom fixtures, new trash cans because the kitchen had a different cabinet layout. When I sat down and did the forensic accounting on my own life over a 9-year period, the numbers were sickening. I had moved 3 times in 9 years for 3 different corporate promotions. Each move cost me roughly $9,000 in physical moving expenses, home preparations, and furniture replacement. Over 9 years, I had spent $27,000 just on the physical act of changing addresses. I used to look at my $20,000 salary bump and feel like a financial genius. But after taxes, that raise was only bringing home about $14,000 extra a year. The entire first 2 years of my new, higher salary were completely wiped out by the physical cost of getting there. I was running on a treadmill. I was working a more stressful job, managing a larger team, and taking on more corporate responsibility just to pay for the privilege of moving my life across the country. And the most terrifying part was that this $27,000 loss was just layer one. It was just the physical stuff I could touch and see. But there was a second layer to the mobility tax, a layer happening entirely on paper, buried inside a stack of legal documents. And it was about to make my physical moving costs look like absolute pocket change. I thought the physical boxes and the new lawnmowers were the real cost of moving. I thought the $27,000 I spent over 9 years was the bottom of the barrel. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. The physical moving costs were just a distraction. The real wealth destruction was happening on paper inside a title company office. I was getting crushed by the transaction friction of the real estate industry. I used to think that as long as my house went up in value between moves, I was making a solid profit. I thought real estate was an automatic wealth builder. Then I found a 2024 dataset from the Federal Housing Finance Agency showing that historically, a normal housing market sees properties appreciate by roughly 4 to 5% per year. I had to stop and process that. If a normal house goes up about 4% a year, and I was selling every 3 years, my total appreciation was barely 12%. That 12% sounded great until I sat down at the closing table to sell my second home. I had bought that house for $300,000. 3 years later, my company offered me a regional director role 2 states away. The housing market had been decent. We listed the house and sold it for $340,000. I looked at the paperwork and saw a $40,000 gain. I felt like an absolute genius. I thought that $40,000 was going straight into my pocket to build my net worth. Then the notary handed me the final settlement statement. In real estate, the seller pays the commission for both the buyer and seller agents. That is usually 6% of the total sale price right off the top. 6% of my $340,000 sale was $20,400. Over $20,000 vanished instantly. Handed to 2 people for taking photos, listing my house on a website, and opening the front door. But the bleeding did not stop there. Then came the closing costs. I had to pay for title insurance, escrow fees, and county transfer taxes. That was another $4,500 gone. Then the buyer had an inspection done and demanded a credit because the water heater was 7 years old. I was desperate to close so I could start my new job. I agreed to a $2,000 credit. Let us do the forensic accounting on my brilliant real estate investment. I started with a $40,000 paper profit. I subtracted $20,400 for the agents. I subtracted $4,500 for closing costs. I subtracted $2,000 for the buyer credit. My massive $40,000 win was instantly reduced to $13,100. Spread over the 3 years I lived there, my house had earned me about $4,300 a year. But remember layer 1? The physical moving truck, the new couches, the utility deposits. Those costs had been roughly $9,000 for that specific move. My real estate profit did not even cover the physical cost of putting my life in boxes. The equity I thought I was building was completely fake. It was entirely consumed by the friction of buying and selling. The real estate agents made more money on my house than I did. I was effectively a highly paid tenant who was responsible for my own maintenance. I looked at the settlement statement and felt sick to my stomach. I was moving for a higher salary, but the transaction costs of housing were wiping out the raise before my first day of work. The mobility tax was taking a 10% bite out of my net worth every 36 months. I thought this transaction friction was the absolute worst of it. I thought I had finally found the bottom of the trap. But I was completely wrong. Because the biggest financial theft of all was not happening when I sold the old house. The real trap closed the exact second I signed the mortgage paperwork to buy the next one, and this took me years to figure out. I thought the $13,000 transaction loss was the bottom of the trap. I really did. I thought losing my equity to real estate agents was the worst financial penalty of moving, but the real wealth destruction was not happening when I sold the old house. The real trap closed the exact second I signed the mortgage paperwork to buy the next one. And this is the part that took me years to figure out, the part nobody tells you. I used to think that when I paid my mortgage every month, I was buying a piece of my house. I thought a $2,000 payment meant I owned $2,000 more of my property. Then, I found a 2022 report from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau explaining the true mechanics of an amortization schedule. I read the document and my stomach completely dropped. The data showed that on a standard 30-year fixed mortgage, the bank front-loads almost all of their profit into the first few years of the loan. Let me show you exactly what my bank was doing to me while I thought I was building an empire. When I bought my second house, I took out a mortgage for $300,000. My interest rate was 6%. My monthly payment for principal and interest was roughly $1,800 a month. I proudly made that payment every single month for 3 years. That is 36 months. 36 payments of $1,800 equals $64,800 out of my pocket. I thought I had paid off over $60,000 of my house. But when I finally looked at the actual amortization schedule, the truth made me physically ill. Out of that $64,800, only about $10,000 actually went toward paying down my loan balance. The other $54,800 went directly to the bank as pure interest. For 3 years, roughly 84% of my housing payment was just a donation to the bank. But here is where the mobility tax becomes absolutely lethal. If you stay in a house for 15 or 20 years, that ratio slowly flips. Eventually, your monthly payment starts actually buying the house. But I never stayed that long. I moved every 36 months for my career. Every time I moved for a promotion, I sold the house. I paid off that loan. Then I bought a new house in the new city, and I took out a brand new 30-year mortgage. Do you see the trap? Every time I signed a new mortgage, I was hitting the reset button. I was sending myself right back to month 1 of the amortization schedule. I was voluntarily putting myself back in the penalty box where 84% of my money went to interest. I did this 3 times in 9 years. I spent almost a decade trapped in the most expensive, wealth-destroying phase of 3 completely different loans. Over those 9 years, I paid 3 different banks a combined total of over $160,000 in interest alone. $160,000 of my hard-earned income vanished into bank profits. And because I kept resetting the clock, my actual equity was practically zero. I was accepting promotions, I was taking on massive corporate stress, I was working 60-hour weeks to earn a higher salary. And every single extra dollar I earned was being quietly siphoned away by the banks and the real estate industry. I was not building a career to make myself rich. I was building a career to fund the banking system. And the full mathematical reality of what I had done to my future was even worse than I thought. I was sitting in my new, half-empty house when I finally opened a blank spreadsheet. I had just realized that my mortgage resets and real estate fees were draining my net worth. But I needed to see the full damage. I needed to compare the path I actually took against the path I rejected. I built a financial model to compare 2 parallel versions of my life. Path 1 was my actual reality. Over 9 years, I chased 3 corporate promotions. I moved 3 different times. I increased my salary from $60,000 a year up to $95,000 a year. But over those exact same 9 years, I paid $27,000 in physical moving costs. I lost roughly $60,000 to real estate agents and closing costs. And I paid $160,000 in front-loaded mortgage interest to 3 different banks. In less than a decade, the mobility tax had extracted $247,000 from my life. $250,000 was gone forever. Then I mapped out path 2. What if I had just stayed put? What if I had rejected the relocations, stayed in my very first house, and accepted standard 3% annual raises instead of chasing 20% promotion bumps? The numbers on the screen were hard to look at. If I had stayed in that first house for 9 straight years, I never would have paid a single real estate agent. I never would have rented a moving truck or bought a new lawnmower. And most importantly, I would have pushed deep into the amortization schedule. By year 9, a huge portion of my monthly payment would have been going directly toward my loan principal. In path 2, my salary would have been $20,000 lower, but my net worth would have been almost $150,000 higher. The corporate promotions were an illusion. I was doing more work and carrying more stress for less actual wealth, but I could not stop there. I needed to see what this looked like over an entire career. I dragged the spreadsheet cells down to simulate a 30-year timeline. I looked at the corporate climber who moves every 3 years for a promotion. Over a 30-year career, that is 10 total moves, 10 real estate commissions, 10 times paying overlapping rent and buying new furniture, and worst of all, 10 times resetting a 30-year mortgage back to month 1. Over 30 years, the serial mover pays over $700,000 just in bank interest and transaction fees. They reach retirement age having practically zero equity because they never stayed anywhere long enough to actually pay off a property. Then I looked at the person who stays in one house for 30 years. They pay exactly $0 in real estate commissions. They pay $0 to movers. And after 30 years, the house is completely paid off. They own a major asset free and clear. The wealth gap between the 2 paths was $1.2 million. I stared at the glowing screen in my dark living room. $1.2 million. That was the true lifetime cost of the mobility tax. That was the price tag of my ambition. I had been trading my actual future wealth for a slightly higher number on my bi-weekly paycheck. The math was undeniably clear. But even looking right at the spreadsheet, I still felt the urge to defend my choices. I still felt the pull of the corporate ladder. And that is when I realized that the mobility tax does not just exploit your wallet. It is designed to exploit human psychology. I stared at that $1.2 million gap and felt entirely foolish. If the math was so obviously terrible, why did I keep doing it? That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck even when I knew the right answer. The mobility tax does not just steal your money. It steals your perspective through something I call the upgrade illusion. I kept falling back into the trap because the system is perfectly designed to reward the behavior it is secretly penalizing. Every time I accepted a relocation, I received an immediate flood of social validation. My company announced my promotion in a company-wide email. Hundreds of people congratulated me on my new job title. My family told me how proud they were that I was moving up in the world. The dopamine hit was massive and immediate, and it completely masked the financial bleeding happening in the background. Nobody throws a party for you when you make your 48th consecutive mortgage payment on the exact same house. Nobody sends you a congratulatory email for allowing your loan amortization schedule to reach the point where 50% of your payment finally goes toward the principal. The most financially sound decisions you can make are entirely invisible to the outside world. Staying put is boring. Building real equity is slow and quiet. But moving to a new city for a director title is loud and exciting. Buying a bigger house in a nicer zip code is a highly visible signal of success. I remember standing in the kitchen of my third house during a small housewarming gathering. The kitchen had beautiful granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a massive center island. My old college roommate walked in, looked around the room, and told me I had really made it. I smiled and agreed with him. I felt incredibly wealthy in that exact moment. What I was completely ignoring was the harsh reality of the bank paperwork sitting in my desk drawer. I technically owned 0% of that granite island. I had just reset my 30-year loan back to month 1. I was essentially renting those beautiful countertops from the bank at a premium interest rate, but because the house was physically larger than my last one, my brain interpreted the transaction as wealth creation. I confused lifestyle inflation with actual net worth. The corporate world and the real estate industry both rely heavily on this exact psychological blind spot. Corporations use a gross salary bump to convince you to uproot your life, knowing you will absorb the hidden friction of the move. Real estate marketing constantly pushes the narrative of the property ladder, encouraging you to upgrade your house every time your salary increases. They sell you the aesthetic of wealth while stripping away the mathematical mechanics of actual wealth building. I was getting played by my own ego. I was trading long-term compound interest for a better background in my corporate video calls. But even as I sat on that moving box and accepted that my ego had cost me a fortune, my brain immediately started fighting back. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now. Because it used to form in mine every single time I considered staying put. The moment I realized I needed to stop moving, I thought about my career ceiling. I thought about the very real rules of corporate America. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now. Because it used to form in mine, I know this sounds unrealistic. I pushed back against this idea for years. When someone first suggested I stop moving, my immediate reaction was completely defensive. I thought about my career. Everyone knows the golden rule of corporate America. If you stay at your desk, you get a 3% cost of living adjustment. If you jump to a new company in a new city, you get a 15 to 20% bump. I used to preach this exact strategy to my own team. I told my junior reps that corporate loyalty was for people who did not like money. You have to move to earn. I used to think that maximizing my gross income through constant relocation was the only way to build wealth. Then I found a study from 2023 by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. The researchers tracked wage growth against geographic mobility. The data showed that while job switchers do see a temporary spike in gross wages, the actual net wealth accumulation of frequent movers over a 10-year period is often much lower than those who stay geographically stable. I read that twice. The people getting the massive 20% raises were actually ending up with less money in the bank a decade later. The people accepting the boring raises were quietly building larger net worths. How is that mathematically possible? Because I was fundamentally misunderstanding how taxes interact with the mobility tax. The gross income increase from a promotion is entirely taxable, but the transaction costs of moving are paid with after-tax dollars. Let me walk you through my own $20,000 raise. After federal taxes, state taxes, and insurance premiums, that $20,000 was only about $14,000 of actual take-home pay. But remember my transaction costs? The real estate commissions, the closing costs, and the physical moving trucks cost me roughly $30,000 to execute. I was handing over $30,000 of my hard-earned, post-tax wealth to buy a $14,000 post-tax income stream. It would take me over 2 full years of working at the new job just to break even on the cost of taking the job. And what was I doing exactly 36 months later? I was packing up and moving again. I was trapped in a permanent break-even cycle. I was sprinting on a treadmill, burning massive amounts of energy, and staying in the exact same financial location. The counterintuitive truth is not that you should stop trying to increase your salary. It is not about giving up your ambition or settling for less money. The truth that finally broke me out of the trap was realizing I had tied 2 completely different financial vehicles together. I had linked my career trajectory directly to my real estate strategy. I assumed a new job required a new deed. The system wants you to believe that advancing your career requires resetting your mortgage. It does not. The moment I separated how I earned my money from how I handled my housing, the math completely flipped in my favor. And escaping the mobility tax did not require me to quit my industry or stop growing. It just required a completely new set of rules for my next promotion. I sat with the reality of that $1.2 million mistake for a long time. I realized that knowing the math was useless if I did not change my behavior. I had to completely rebuild my relationship with my career. The first thing I did was change how I evaluated a promotion. I stopped looking at the gross salary bump. I started calculating my break-even horizon. 2 years after that night on the moving boxes, my company offered me another promotion. They wanted me to move to Chicago for a vice president role. The offer included a $30,000 raise. In the past, I would have signed the paperwork instantly and started looking for real estate, but this time, I opened my spreadsheet. I calculated the 6% agent commission on selling my current house. I added the closing costs for taking out a brand new mortgage in Chicago. I added the physical moving truck, the deposits, and the furniture replacement costs. The total transaction friction to take this new job was roughly $48,000. Then I looked at the raise itself. After federal taxes and state taxes, that $30,000 bump was only $21,000 of actual take-home pay. My break-even horizon was over 2 full years. I would be working the harder job, managing a larger team, and carrying more stress for 26 months just to pay off the cost of taking the job. So I took my second step. I separated my career growth from the real estate industry. I went back to my boss with a counteroffer. I told them I wanted the role, but I wanted to stay exactly where I was and travel to Chicago when necessary. I explained that uprooting my life was not mathematically worth it for me. They pushed back. They said they needed a vice president physically sitting in the Chicago office. So I did something I had never done before in my entire professional life. I turned down a $30,000 raise. It was terrifying. My ego hated it. I watched a colleague take the promotion and get the company-wide congratulatory email. But my spreadsheet told me I had made the right mathematical decision. Instead of moving, I stayed in my house. I kept making my normal mortgage payments. I let my loan age another year, pushing further down the amortization schedule so more of my money actually went toward the principal. And I started actively looking for remote director roles at competing companies. 5 months later, I found one. It offered a $20,000 raise, and I did not have to move a single cardboard box. I took the job. I kept the entire $20,000 raise. I paid $0 in real estate commissions. I paid $0 to moving companies. I did not reset my mortgage. For the first time in my career, a raise actually felt like a raise. My net worth jumped forward instantly instead of moving sideways. But getting a remote job is not always possible. Sometimes you absolutely have to move for your career or your family, and that is when I had to create a new set of rules for the property I already owned. I knew that eventually I would have to relocate again. Life happens. Companies restructure, families grow. So the third step I took was creating a strict rule for my existing real estate. When I finally did have to move 3 years later for a family reason, I completely refused to sell my house. I looked at the estimated settlement statement and saw $22,000 in agent commissions and closing costs. I refused to pay it. I refused to reset the amortization schedule. I refused to be the battery powering the local real estate market. Instead, I kept the property and turned it into a rental. My mortgage payment was $1,800 a month. I rented the house out for $2,200 a month. The tenant was covering the entire mortgage, the taxes, and leaving me a small cash buffer for maintenance. But the most important part was not the $400 of monthly cash flow. The most important part was the hidden math happening quietly in the background. Because I did not sell the house, I saved $22,000 instantly. Because I kept the mortgage open, the amortization clock kept ticking forward. The loan was getting older and more mature. Every single month, a larger piece of that $2,200 rent check went directly toward paying down my principal loan balance. My true ownership equity was growing automatically while I was sleeping. Then I created my final rule for the new city. When I arrived, I did not immediately call a real estate agent to buy a new house. I signed a lease on a rental apartment. I made a promise to myself. I would not sign another 30-year mortgage until I was mathematically certain I would stay in that exact zip code for a minimum of 7 to 10 years. I used to think renting was throwing money away, but the spreadsheet proved that renting for 2 or 3 years is vastly superior to the financial slaughter of buying and selling a house over that same short window. Renting gave me total geographic flexibility. It protected my net worth from the devastating wealth extraction of the mobility tax. When I finally ran the lifetime numbers on my new strategy, the relief was overwhelming. By holding my first property and refusing to churn real estate fees, my projected net worth at retirement jumped by hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was finally building real equity instead of just a real estate resume. I used to think that climbing the corporate ladder was the only way to build wealth. I thought if I just worked harder, managed more people, and moved to bigger cities, the math would automatically work out in my favor. But here is the truth that changed everything for me. You cannot out-earn a broken system. You cannot build long-term wealth if you voluntarily hand 10% of your net worth to the banking and real estate industries every 3 years. The ultimate financial flex is not buying a new house in a new city. It is keeping the money you already earned. It is staying put long enough to actually own the ground you are standing on. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.